From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
Late on Monday night, it sounded like the Archbishop of Canterbury had cleared his diary for the Tuesday, which was obviously rather interesting, given does that mean he's going to announce a resignation? Does that mean he's just having conversations with colleagues or lawyers or whoever about his position? We weren't quite sure what to expect. The big thing that had changed was the fact that a lot of the people who'd been criticising him over the weekend in terms of priests within the church, it's true to say they were priests who had issues with Welby over other reasons, and so maybe he might have thought, look, these are people with access to grind over other things, and maybe I can ride this out. But then on Monday, the Bishop of Newcastle said, I think he should go, and that was kind of the killer blow, really.
I think that it's very hard for the church, as the established church, to continue to have a moral voice in any way, shape or form in our nation when we cannot get our own house in order with regard to something as critically important, something that would be asked of any institution, let alone the church.
On Tuesday morning, we were hearing very little from Lambeth Palace as to is he going to say something today at least. But it's emerged, it came out about an hour or two later. I finally got a message back from Lambeth Palace saying, give us a second. And then there was the statement dropping saying that he'd offered his resignation.
In a statement, the Archbishop says, "It's clear that I must take personal and institutional responsibility for the long and re-traumatising period between 2013 and 2024.
The story today, inside the scandal that brought down an archbishop.
I'm Kaya Burgess. I have an unusual dual patch of being both religious affairs correspondent and science reporter at the Times.
Okay, well, we're very much on your religious beat today. And you've met the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, before, haven't you? You've interviewed him before. What's he like?
Oh, I mean, scores of times, yeah. In terms of one-on-one interviews at Lambeth Palace and been at General Synod, which is the church's sort of assembly, and met him many times there, and you sort of bump into him in the bar afterwards, which is a strange experience. And yes, the most intimate experience I suppose I had was I spent best part of a week travelling in Ukraine during the war with him. So we had to get a sort of 17-hour sleeper train from Warsaw to Kyiv, and it was me and him and 2 or 3 others on this very small group taking sleeper trains in and out of a war zone. So yes, I've met him many times.
And what's he like as an interviewee and as a person?
I mean, he's described in the Times as leader today as a kind of a decent and thoughtful figure, as somebody who is willing to speak his mind, even when it gets him in hot water, which clearly it does kind of fairly regularly. One of his biggest concerns is unity. It's a word you hear him use a lot. He knows that the Church of England is divided into a lot of tribal camps on different issues. He knows the history of the church. I mean, there used to be one church, at the beginning, and then you can see there's a great map online somewhere as it branches into this branch, the great schism of the Orthodox, then of course the Reformation, English Reformation. The Church of England is split with Methodists, and so he's just so keen for that not to happen that he's often very careful in terms of how he words things. You can see the cogs turn as he talks in terms of, am I going to be saying something controversial here? He's happy to do it if it's going to wind up politicians sometimes, but he's careful on internal church matters. So he's a very careful person, which is why it's obviously more difficult for him to have had to stand down over an issue like this.
Yes, and this standing down, how dramatic and historic is it? If we think on the spectrum of an archbishop quietly standing down as expected at one end and Thomas Becket being bludgeoned to death on the other, where does this lie in that?
Well, exactly, yes. Being bludgeoned to death in your own cathedral is clearly top of the list of ways to go out, or bottom of the list, depending on how you look, of ways to go out as Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas Cranmer was kicked out of office for supposed heresy and then executed during the whole time of the Reformation in that period. A number of others have been, the word is deprived of office when they're kind of kicked out for various reasons going back to the 11th century. One, the king eventually chose someone else, or they fell foul of the Pope. In the 17th century, one refused to sort of swear allegiance to King William and Queen Mary, and so sort of resigned / was kicked out. But a professor of church history told me that to resign over a kind of accusation of mishandling something, of negligence in some way, is, I think his phrase was, historic and without exact precedent.
And in terms of that mishandling, this has all happened because of this independent review into how the case of a very prolific child abuser, John Smyth, was allegedly covered up by the church over many, many decades. Rewind for us, Kaya. Who was Smyth? And we're going back to the 1970s and 80s, aren't we?
I'm John Smyth. I'm the director of JASA, as we call the Justice Alliance. And my background is as a British advocate.
Smyth, he was born in Canada, came to the UK when he was about 10. So he came to the UK in the early 50s. He eventually became a barrister, and he was quite well known in the mid-70s because he represented Mary Whitehouse, which obviously some people will remember was the big morality campaigner. She sued the Gay News newspaper for blasphemous libel, which itself sounds a little medieval, and he represented her in that. He then went on to be part of the trust that ran these Christian camps called Iwern, or Uern rather. He ran these camps, people would go and stay there, and a very young Justin Welby, so at this point he was, I think, about 19, Justin Welby. He'd only just started coming to faith. He wasn't brought up particularly Christian, but came to faith later in life. He attended, he said he found Smyth quite impressive. Smyth came from this sort of evangelical school of the church where it often relies on there being one quite influential, charismatic person at the kind of head of these sorts of groupings. There's no evidence that Welby and Smyth were friends or hung out or anything like that. Smyth and Welby stayed in the same dormitory for 2 camps. There isn't any evidence of them being particularly close. It later emerged, essentially, that, and we've learned this over the past 10 years, publicly at least, it emerged that Smyth was grooming, is the only word for it really, young men, teenage boys, getting them into his trust, making them see him as a sort of spiritual father figure, telling them that, you know, he was sort of doing God's work. But he had these obsessions with things like masturbation and sex. And if these boys ever masturbated, he told them they had to tell him. And that was a real deviance. And he would take them to the shed up in his garden and he would beat them. But I mean, he would hundreds of strokes with a cane. He would even provide nappies to some of these boys to absorb how much they were bleeding afterwards. And yet these boys were so sort of thralled to him because he had groomed them that they thought, well, he says that God wants this to happen and that we're being punished for something sinful and that this is kind of right. They say that because corporal punishment was still legal at the time, that people sort of thought, well, you know, boys getting the odd stroke from a cane, what's wrong with that? But this was sexual in nature. There is evidence of him sort of kissing the backs of boys' necks while he's beating them. He eventually moves to Africa. He moved to Zimbabwe in 1984, with the understanding being that some of these rumors about his abuse had come to the attention of people who were running the camps kind of with him, part of that trust, who wanted him to be gotten out of the way, shall we say. They didn't want it to become public. But then one survivor of abuse in Zimbabwe has said it was essentially just exporting the abuse, because 85 boys in Zimbabwe and later South Africa, where he moved, were also abused in a similar way. And this continued throughout 80s, 90s, noughties, even into the 2010s, which is why he was dubbed by the report the most prolific serial abuser ever to be associated with the Church of England.
And in terms of how all of this came to public knowledge, this is mainly down to a Channel 4 documentary in 2017, isn't it?
In every great move of God, there's always a snake in the garden somewhere, and John Smyth was that snake in the garden.
Yes, that was what sort of blew it open to public understanding. There had been articles about it before in isolated cases, but that was the one that really kind of grabbed the public imagination.
I think we just fell under his spell and we came to believe everything that he told us.
That's finally when police started looking into it, and they wanted him for questioning to bring back from South Africa, possibly to extradite him. But then he died in 2018 quite suddenly, which obviously means that, he was never brought to justice, could never answer for any of these abuses, which is a huge issue. Of course, when you're a survivor of abuse, you want to see the abuser brought to justice, and that they feel that was denied by these decades of delay. This report as well, it's been so delayed. I've been getting these little releases every few months going, sorry, it's going to be another few months. Sorry, it's going to be another few months. And that's been driving the survivors mad. He died in 2018 before he could be brought to justice. And this really made clear to people how unacceptable the delays had been. And in 2018, the church said, well, look, we're going to commission an independent person to come in and review this. It was then 2019 before that was properly commissioned and someone was in place. And, we're now 5 years on from that. And it's taken this long. People have been waiting and waiting, knowing it was going to be quite explosive when it came out.
So in terms of Justin Welby's role and knowledge throughout all of this, what did the Making review say happened?
Well, I think one point to make in this is, it was part of my job over the past, many years. I have read dozens, if not scores, of reviews like this one into either individual cases of abuse by other individuals, bishops, priests, and whoever, or groups of cases, or the church's handling. And there are so many occasions over those years where quite senior figures are accused of cover-ups, of literally receiving a report about an abusive priest or bishop and thinking, look, this is going to damage the reputation of the church if this gets out. I'm going to turn a blind eye, dismiss it, even kind of cover it up. That accusation has not been made against Justin Welby. He's not accused of covering up or trying to kind of defend this guy, John Smyth, in any way. But he's the head of the institution that failed over all these years to bring him to justice. And the interesting thing in this case is, of course, that Welby has a connection with Smyth. So Justin Welby was in his late teens when he first attended these camps run by Smyth. He said he found Smyth quite an impressive figure because Smyth set himself up as this kind of charismatic sort of leader of these camps. Welby was not a priest at the time. He wasn't involved in any sort of way with the Church of England in any administrative or senior sense. But in 1981, when Welby was living in Paris, Smyth sort of came through Paris with a group of boys on a trip. And the priest at the church where Welby worshipped in Paris sort of said, oh, you sort of you must have heard of Smyth. You went to the camps. And Welby said yes. And then this priest said to Welby, I chatted to one of the boys. It sounds like this Smyth, he's really not a nice man, was one phrase. And another one was, I wouldn't have anything to do with him if I were you. And Welby has said to the review, and since he said, I thought, it was quite a vague comment. He said it left him with no suspicion that this was anything to do with abuse or beatings or anything like it, just that maybe he was an abrasive personality or maybe just not a particularly nice bloke, but didn't think more about it. And he had no official position at the time that he had to sort of report this to anybody.
And he was what at this point? Mid-20s?
Yeah, he would have been 24, 5 years old, working in the oil industry. So, that was it. This one priest saying, he's not a very nice guy. I wouldn't have much to do with him if I were you. And Welby sort of saying, okay. It then emerges, however, that, Welby and Smyth exchanged Christmas cards for a few years after this, with Welby saying, I'm a Christian. I exchange Christmas cards with kind of a lot of people that I come across. He also donated money twice, about £40 to a sort of mission that John Smyth was running in Zimbabwe. And again, Welby said, you did that at the time. You tried to support people doing kind of Christian work around the world. But there's no evidence beyond that of them maintaining any sort of close friendship, relationship, correspondence, or any evidence that Welby had, in the report says there's nothing to suggest he knew of the extent of Smyth's abuses, but should he have been aware that there was some sort of concern about him?
And yet, at this point, within the actual hierarchies of the church, they are onto Smyth, aren't they?
Well, see, this is the difficult thing, is that a priest compiles a report in 1982 documenting some of Smyth's abuses, some of which in this report are clearly would be, criminal acts, if true. And it was circulated not to sort of senior church leaders, but within this sort of circle of people around Smyth, essentially. And it was not passed to police. And there's even one of the priests involved said, we thought this would do real damage to the work of God if it was made public. So again, this theme of protecting the sort of reputation. And it seems that over periods from then, little words of warning were whispered. You know, when Smyth would go somewhere, someone said, well, kind of a bit like what was said to Welby, you want to watch out for him, but without anyone saying quite why. It wasn't until 2013 that the allegations were first sort of formally made to the church's hierarchies and systems. And that then becomes the key point where the questions are raised over, well, who did what with those allegations? What should they have done? And where were the failings?
Kai, we're discussing the events that have led to the resignation, the historic resignation, as you were saying earlier, of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. And you're just explaining all of the allegations over the years and concerns about this prolific child abuser, John Smyth. And we got to the point where in 2013, finally, a proper report is compiled. Victims have come forward, and Justin Welby, for it is he, is the top dog in the church. What does he do with that information? What do the people around him do with that information?
So these allegations come to the church in the summer of 2013, so just a few months after Justin Welby has become Archbishop of Canterbury. And they come predominantly to the diocese of Ely, which is kind of the local area. And it's the Bishop of Ely at the time, Stephen Conway, who's sort of in charge of this. But then it's passed up to Lambeth Palace as a kind of a report, particularly because people thought, didn't Justin Welby know Smyth many years ago? Should we not let him know about this? And the report finds that Justin Welby did essentially follow the sort of church's protocol at the time, which was not anywhere near as robust then as it is now, and probably should be even more so in the future. But that Justin Welby was told that these allegations had been passed on to police to investigate, which is obviously what should have happened. And Justin Welby therefore accepted those assurances and thought, obviously, good, glad that's happening. At least that's all in hand. Job done, in a sense. The problem was it hadn't been passed to police. An informal conversation had happened with a police officer, but no formal report referral had been made, no crime report. The trouble and the criticism comes in that the Bishop of Ely, the Archbishop of Canterbury's chaplain called Joe Bailey-Wells, and then the Archbishop himself did not then check back in. They did not then say, well, look, let's pursue the police on this. Let's check what's happening. Is this being investigated? Are we checking that he's not still abusing people elsewhere? They just sort of thought, well, that's being dealt with now, and sort of moved on.
And also just leaving it to the police and not necessarily thinking at that point, oh, well, should we do our own internal review as to how this could happen and whether we have processes in place to make sure that this is caught? How did the Macon review characterise that?
Well, again, it's important to note with the criticism of Justin Welby, which is that he was actually told that the church shouldn't be going to the people who led the Christian camps where Smyth was while a police investigation is going on. That's what they were told, that it would be kind of interfering, if you like, and wait to hear from the police what they advise us to do. Of course, they never heard from the police because the police hadn't received a proper referral of the crime report, and therefore, nothing ever came. And so again, it sort of felt like he sort of acted properly in the sense the report says that he was ill-advised by other people, but that the phrase they use is that there was a distinct lack of curiosity shown in following this up, and that perhaps Welby himself should have thought, look, I'm going to be linked with this guy. I knew him years ago. He wasn't a friend, but I knew him. I should probably be extra certain that that this is being pursued properly. But interestingly, the Archbishop's chaplain, Joe Bailey-Wells, sort of said, look, we were so busy at the time and we were having a lot of these sorts of reports of abuse kind of coming in. And so suggesting perhaps that we didn't have time or resources or whatever to be following and chasing up, each individual one of them.
And the issue here is not just that this led to a delay in justice being done, but Smyth died in 2018, so actually never had to answer for these crimes.
Well, that's a big deal as well, but there's the suggestion that his abuses continued up to his death, which means that, of course, people could have been saved from abuse if more had been done more quickly. And that's why today, actually, I've been reporting on the fact that if Justin Welby has stood down, are there not others, such as he's now the Bishop of Lincoln, Stephen Conway, who has apologised? He said he believed he did all he could at the time, but now says maybe I should have done more. Should he be considering his position if he's as culpable, if not perhaps more over this particular scenario than Welby was, perhaps.
And what kind of pressure would there be on someone like him to do that? I mean, what can you sense behind closed doors?
Well, the survivors have already said that, Welby resigning, the buck stops at the top often in this sort of situation. And the Archbishop of York has said, look, he's sort of taken the blame for the institutional failings. But some have said, why should others not go too? The Bishop of Birkenhead said on Wednesday morning, it could well be that others should resign.
I think very possibly some other people should go. I mean, I'm not here to name names. I don't think I know the answer to that. But I think what I'm saying is this is not just all about the Archbishop of Canterbury.
No, it's not.
The work begins and continues from this point.
The Archbishop of York said, well, there are people here who covered up this abuse. And there's no suggestion that Welby or this Bishop of Lincoln tried to conceal anything. They just weren't proactive enough in sort of pursuing it. But a lot of the people involved are either dead or not holding any particular position of authority these days. So it's hard to know who else is likely to feel they need to step down or to be pressured to do so.
How big a split, a schism, is there in this? You were saying that Justin Welby at the top has been someone who's very keen on unity. Has the questions that this review has raised, and has the fact that he decided to resign, has that caused a bit of a split within the church, within the bishops?
Only one bishop came out beforehand to say he should go. And now a number have come out, which is obviously it's easy to say now and say, well, he's done the right and honourable thing. But, his resignation isn't going to change anything. The whole process over the last 10, 15 years, as all these reviews have come out saying that the Church of England, the Catholic Church, their whole handling of this stuff is terrible. There are inherent conflicts of interest because bishops are in charge not only of investigating wrongdoing among priests, but they're also in charge of looking after the well-being of their priests. Surely that should be taken away and given to some sort of independent watchdog. There's been some pushback in local parishes who perhaps reject this idea that everyone needs to constantly be on the lookout for sort of paedophiles in their midst and the money spent and all sorts of, it's been a huge kind of debate and it's not really got anywhere. That's one of the things I think Welby said in his resignation statement, that I've tried and tried and tried over the 12 years to improve processes. A lot more money is spent. There are a lot more staff members who are in charge of this stuff now. But people would say, is it much better?
But there's a lot of reviews to get your head around, but there has been a review into their safeguarding practices led by Alexis Jay. And she's accused them of dragging their feet still on her recommendations. On top of all of this, how damning a charge is that after all of this kind of stuff has come to light, they still maybe haven't put into practice the changes which have been asked of them?
The Bishop of Newcastle, who spoke out this week, she called it disgraceful earlier this year that Synod, which is the church's sort of parliament, had not fully endorsed Professor Jay's recommendations. So yes, it is damning. The church has tried to set up these watchdogs. They keep collapsing. It is quite a damning failure that they are still, like the Catholic Church to an extent too, still struggling so much with this.
Finally, Kai, how much of a challenge is ahead, not just for the church as they need to find a new Archbishop of Canterbury and need to get on top of all of this stuff, but also for those victims of John Smyth who still haven't got justice and are still seeing this case thrashed out and mishandled?
I've spoken to quite a few survivors over the years and recently about this, and they I having covered a lot of these sorts of reports, but also having covered, for example, for many years, the infected blood inquiry. What people want out of these sorts of reports can differ. Sometimes they want a scalp, they want heads to roll, or prosecutions even. Sometimes having a report that acknowledges what happened, that it happened, how awful it was, can provide some closure, because for decades they've either been disbelieved or trivialized. That can be a very big deal. So I think this has been a really important moment for those survivors. But there are many survivors of other abuses in the church who still don't feel they've been given the right support. The huge challenge now, of course, is, whoever comes in, and it takes a long time to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury, whoever comes in is going to be faced with this huge, huge mess that still needs fixing. It's a job that some people would say, who on earth would want it?
Kai Burgess, religious affairs correspondent for The Times, and you can read his latest coverage at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. If you or someone you know has been affected by any of the subjects covered in the episode today, we've put information on support groups in the episode description. The producers today were Taryn Siegel and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition was by Mal Assetto. Leave us a comment or review wherever you're listening to this podcast, and maybe if you found it interesting, send a link to someone who you think might also enjoy listening. I'm Luke Jones. See you tomorrow.